I just told this story to share my enjoyable moment of producing a first ever translation of the Koldo in the history of Telugu literature. And later, this publication of this translation resulted in an upsurge of Manto's translation into Telugu when Urdu literacy has begun to fade out among the post-80s Muslims in South India, Andhra Pradesh particularly. Whereas during the post-partition times, even non-Muslims were influenced directly by Manto from reading his Urdu works. Things took a different shape when the post-80s new generation of Muslim writers in Telugu has to depend on just Telugu translations. In this presentation, I will introduce three generations of Telugu writers who read and were influenced by Manto's writings. The first generation writers directly from Manto's Urdu writings, second generation from his English translations, while contemporary generation just from Telugu translations. For each generation, it's a different avatar of Manto, as meanings continually shifted, and the writings of Manto have been recontextualized every time. My basic idea is to complicate this entire notion of the term influence that often sounds like a casual or marginal term, while it definitely has ideological and historical connections in the post-colonial writings in India. The presence of Manto is something more than influence in Telugu, where he actually becomes an actor in the making of a new generation of writers and readers, particularly reconstructing various Muslim contexts in a dominantly Hindu-centric literary tradition. Let me make a confession. I have several beginnings for this presentation, which also means that obviously I have no clear conclusion. Just now I also started realizing that I should have listened to Akbar Bhai's suggestion just to talk about the story Thua. However, since I also belong to that Mantoist, not Maoist, I listen less to others and care for my own agenda. Let me make this agenda clear. My goal is very simple, to try to understand what does it mean by Manto beyond the domain of Urdu language and literary culture. As we can see further in this presentation, for many Telugu writers, Urdu is not merely a language, it's more a metaphor for a minoritized discourse, in this case a new Muslim subjectivity that spurred after the partition. Indeed, this presentation is a part of chapter from my current book on partition writing in Telugu and Deccani Urdu, exploring the question of a new post-partition Muslim subjectivity. At this point, I aim to offer a few theoretical propositions on how various generations read and interpreted Urdu writers such as Manto or Ismat Chugtai in the literary culture of Telugu. This presentation has two parts. First, I will locate Manto in the specific historical context of the post-1950s Muslim context in Telugu, and secondly, I will discuss the politics of reading and interpretation in relation to Manto's writing. However, underlying these aspects, I intend to understand how the politics of translation work in modern literary cultures such as Urdu and Telugu. I argue that translation is not an activity merely connected to two specific languages. However, these dynamics between the languages also generate an alternative grammar of aesthetics that define the contours of constantly shifting identity discourses. For these communities, translation is also an act of reading and interpreting. In the first section, let me give a sense of what does it mean by Manto in Telugu or its local Telugu, local cultural atmosphere. I was just asked to write a foreword for a Telugu translation of Ismat Chugtai's stories, which would be out soon in Telugu. Now you know what I am going to talk about. Around the 50s, from what I heard from my father or my father's Telugu speaking and Urdu writing friends, apparently there was a lot of folklore or anecdotes about Manto, which in a way were more popular than the original stories written by Manto. Very clearly, Manto also really enjoyed this folklore from Hyderabad. Particularly mentioning all this halchal, he noted, whatever the truth, it is curious that in all of India, only the men and women of Hyderabad have been so concerned about Ismat's marriage and mine. However, we need to realize that these stories and anecdotes were, though personal, there has been a continuous anxiety about Manto's question of Muslim identity and Isma's proto-feminist thought. As the local literary community was really intrigued by various writings of Manto and Isma Chugtai at the same time. One of the goals of my work is to retrieve this cultural memory and literary history of the post-partition writing in Telugu. At the outset, let me also make it clear that Telugu and Urdu had an inseparable and shared literary culture until the partition. Between 1945 and 1955, there were two diagonally opposite literary cultures that were dominant in the state of Hyderabad. One mimicking a version of colonial modernity, another a distinctively produced local modernity. While the first aspect of modernity confined to the coastal belt of Andhra, which was under the colonial British rule, deeply influenced by various English prose writers, and most of the writers from this region were literally mimicking various forms, including the English novel and short story, to produce a colonial modernity. In the next phase, these writers turned towards the national language Hindi and refashioned their writings following various paradigms provided by the history of modern Hindi literature. Contrary to this, the literary culture in the Deccan state of Hyderabad, now Telangana, manifested in a totally different cultural atmosphere, as Urdu provided a model for many modern literary transformations that include the emergence of a new print culture, book publishing market, and public literary culture. Various Telugu short story writers in this region were translating Premchand from Urdu, not Hindi. In the next phase, around the partition, writers such as Manto and Isma Chugtai took over this central position by impacting local writers, particularly short story writers, whereas the leftist mode of Makhdoom Mohyuddin remained a model for many poets in Telugu. Most importantly, Manto's writing functioned as a device to break the silence in the post-partition Telugu writings, particularly on the issues of Muslim, and retrieving the voice of the minoritized Muslims, particularly a feminine voice of the Muslim community. Manto's stories provided two distinctive paradigms in the making of new short story during the 50s. First such paradigm was to locate local Muslim in the post-partition community when the majoritarian discourse yielded to a polarized, segregated Hindu-Muslim markers. Short stories and short novels written by a new generation of prose writers such as Kaviraj, Nellore Kesavaswamy, and Alvar Swami mostly focused on retrieving various Muslim characters, Muslim context to highlight their changing role in a new social life of polarizations. Simultaneously, they also reflected the changing notions of representation against the progressive canon and the myth of national identity, while contesting the institutions of Raj, the norms of feudal India, and the entry of colonial modernity. In the case of Telugu short story, many non-Muslim writers spoke in the voice of Muslim minority at various levels, such as using Islamicate culture as a benchmark to talk about their local culture and highlighting Urdu literary culture in their legacy. Acknowledging the impact of Manto on their writings, both Kaviraj and Kesavaswamy mentioned more than once that Manto taught them how to translate new paradigms of prose writing into Telugu. Kaviraj's short novel, My Garib Hoon, in Telugu, openly mimics Manto's writing style. In an interview, Kaviraj said, "I actually don't even imagine a new prose with such a pungent imagery, irony, satire without Manto. We read Manto repeatedly and lived with those sentences for long. If you ask me about my novel, I would say it's a longer version of Manto's Toba Tek Singh. I was 25 when I read it for the first time, and it became hard for me not being overtaken by those powerful Manto sentences, both in thought and narration." Manto's story, Toba Tek Singh, and Kaviraj's novel, Telugu novel, My Garib Hoon, were published in the same year. Kaviraj wrote this novel first in Urdu and then in Telugu, and this Telugu version ran into several editions between 1949 and 55. For the first time in the history of modern Telugu writing, Kaviraj's novel portrayed the trauma of the post-partition Muslim and Hindu life in the city of Hyderabad. However, following the model of Toba Tek Singh, Kaviraj denied to attribute any specific identity to his protagonist. For the next generation, who read and interpreted Manto not from the Urdu translations but from English and Telugu translations, Manto's works represented a new reality to drift away from a normative realism with fixed conclusions prescribed by the progressive canon. The 1960s writers, including Smile and Nagnamuni, who portrayed the trauma of post-independence local life, perceived contemporary life as a bundle of disillusionments and enchantments. For them, Manto became an embodiment of a fragmented realism or counter-realism. In one of our conversations, Smile, a prominent short story writer, said, Manto gave me a new diction to talk about this new condition of violence after the 60s, a violence that seeped into our everyday lives. Although I was born into a Muslim family, I barely read or write Urdu. I read Manto in English. It's not about language, it is a different translating experience when I needed to talk about a new violence that began to take hold of us. I would read Manto repeatedly to translate this new reality, a reality that is fragmented and breaking us into thousand pieces. However, for the next generation of writers in the post-90s Hindu nationalism, once again Manto became a source of rethinking the religious boundaries in South Asia. In Telegu, Muslim writing turned into an alternate tradition for the mainstream Hindu dominant literary practices in the 90s. Most of these Muslim writers began to see the partition as a metaphor while reflecting on their new Muslim experience filled with a new trauma followed by the demolition of the Babri Masjid. By this time, most of Manto's stories, including his sketches and court proceedings, were published and debated prominently in the Telugu literary sphere. One literary magazine has also published a special issue on Manto's court proceedings, which itself shows how important is Manto for this new literary community. In the 90s, many Muslim writers in Telugu began to understand Manto as a connecting link for various new literary ideas such as historical memory, the death of authorial intention, the emergence of a new reader, polyphonic narrative, and most importantly, constructing an open text. This aspect actually takes me to the second part of this presentation, where I intended to talk about the politics of reception of Manto's writing. I have so many things to share here. Of course, some of these aspects I have already discussed. To explain this impact clearly, I will refer to one short novel where Manto is a protagonist. In 1967, Hindi writer Durgadat Tripathi wrote a novel with a title, Manto Mila Tha. The novel begins with the first reading experience of Manto and continues as a long conversation between an imagined Manto and Tripathi as they keep talking about Manto. The entire narration of this novel is premised on the idea of unraveling different narrative strategies in Manto's writing, complicating the role of the narrator in the story and the devices such as satire and irony as a legacy of Manto's writing. This novel uses all these techniques to reveal the personality of Manto as a person and writer. This takes me back to 1985's Salim Akhtar's question, is Manto necessary today? Salim Akhtar put it, the short story writers of today seem to be more fearful than those of the previously constructed period. Trembling before the Islamic parties, the critics, and even the reviewers are like damp wood in the literary fire. They need a Manto, not to teach them the fine points of the art of the short story, but to spur them on, to shake them up, and arouse them. Once again, the doors of the mind are locked in Pakistan. Once again, the air is stale and the breath is constricted and suffocated. Although we need a strong voice with the courage to reopen the window, our era has not yet succeeded in creating its Manto. Consequently, we need today not only a Saadat Hasan Manto, but one with even greater vehemence. I conclude this presentation with my own imagined association with Manto. As a person and writer, I grew up in what we call secular society with a pluralist dream. While walking to my school and college in my hometown, I would read the writings on the wall such as Musalman ke Dohistan, Pakistan ya Khabaristan. This was a reminder on daily basis for my identity, and I was clearly marked as a Muslim. A person whose body and mind were blamed to be wandering somewhere else in Pakistan, a place I just know on the map. This was a marker as thick as the boundary line between India and Pakistan. In Manto's world, Toba Tek Singh had two options, either India or Pakistan, though he denies both in essence. In my world, I also have two options, Pakistan or a graveyard. In such a conditioned state of mind and body, Manto is not just a short story writer for me. As Manto himself said, he's more than a god. When I read Manto or translate Manto or share anything about Manto, it's my painful effort to open my public wounds. Just open it.